Planning for ways that citizens can walk, roll, or run around town has been a part of Fort Smith's history since even before the city was incorporated. Today, I have for you a ride through time exploring the evolving history of cycling in Fort Smith. The background footage is shot here in Fort Smith from my Ozark Trail G1 Explorer from Walmart. If you're bike curious, this is the best bicycle on the market for its price. Go read some reviews, but I think you'll like it if you're looking for a bike in this price range. Most of this research was done using the Fort Smith Library and the Fort Smith Museum of History. Keep this in mind because the primary source documents I have available can sway in the direction of prevailing attitudes at the time. You could say this isn't just a look at cycling history, it's a look at Fort Smith's media history. So with that, let's pedal through some of the milestones, the pioneers, and the stories that have made cycling in Fort Smith what it is today. We can debate if bicycles have a definitive starting point in Fort Smith, but at some point in the late 1860s or 1870s, they arrived, and they were immediately a spectacle that everyone wanted to try. This story depicts a fictional and humorous conversation between two men, likely immigrants, seeing a bicycle for the first time. The first one says, "Why, if here isn't a cove, it's been condemned to transportation on an itinerary treadmill." So this person is likely a Scotch-Irish immigrant, and some of these words are slang. Cove is another word for chap, and in those days, a treadmill would have been one of those large circular wheels that a donkey turns to mill grain. So he's essentially saying, here comes a man who has to get around on farm equipment. And his companion responds, "No, my old honeycomb, it's only the latest fashion in donkey carts, and the donkey has run away with itself, that's all." So from this we can infer that in 1869, a bicycle was a known piece of machinery, and these two men being depicted as rubes essentially tells us that the modern, sophisticated man knows what a bicycle is. But we can also tell that that's probably not true. This story from the same newspaper also features a humorous story of a husband and wife purchasing a bicycle for $60 and failing miserably when they try to ride it. Mr. and Mrs. Spoopendike was a syndicated humor column that ran in newspapers all over the country, including in Fort Smith, but in the Spoopendike canon, they live in Brooklyn, so this story doesn't exactly apply to Fort Smith. Another reason we know that bicycles were a spectacle and seen as unusual or new age is because so many circuses and fairs featured bicycle riding as an event to sell tickets. This article lists bicycle riding as part of the menagerie in W. Cole's circus, which was scheduled to come to Fort Smith. Here's an ad for that circus. I just love these old graphics. A year later, a competing circus, the Celis Show, came to Fort Smith and featured a family of bicycle riders as part of its spectacle. We also have this article about an upcoming circus held by a B. Doris that would feature bicycles alongside a spotted elephant, a knife thrower, and dens of wild and performing animals. And just 9 years later, in 1895, the Fort Smith Daily News Record called bicycles the Great Fad and featured a recurring column that I found a lot while researching this, Bicycle Chat. I could not find any record of Bicycle Chat being syndicated, and in another article they talk a lot about Arkansas cycling, so I think our local paper had this recurring section just for bicycle news. By the fin de siècle, the novelty of bicycles had begun to wear off and they were becoming a legitimate piece of technology for transportation and exercise. They were, in a sense, commonplace. And the same pushback that cyclists get now also started in this era. We start seeing articles about bicycle crashes resulting in bruises and hurt feelings, such as this woman crashing her bike into a fat man, or this man crashing into a pig. We start seeing pushback from the auto industry, specifically against streetcars and cyclists. First is this article arguing that cycling somehow hurts businesses like shoemakers, piano makers, and theaters. The article goes on to refute these arguments and says that cycling has increased the suburban real estate business by 30%. Then we have this story about how cycling can lead to injury and how cyclists just aren't fashionable. And another story about Fort Smith police cracking down on cyclists riding on the sidewalk or without lights. and this story about how cyclists feel unwelcome on the street. Streetcar lines, livery stables, and many other businesses suffered heavy losses. This informal pushback against cycling induced demand for a pro-cycling movement. Today we know them as the League of American Wheelmen, or LAW. The Wheelmen started in Rhode Island in 1880 when Providence was a center of wealth. Some of the first wheelmen were John Jacob Astor, Diamond Jim Brady, and John D. Rockefeller Sr., whose grandson would become our state's 37th governor. Bicycle advocacy is in our blood. I can't stress enough how important the League of American Wheelmen were on the history of Arkansas. RDOT published a history of their own organization, and they give the League of American Wheelmen and the Good Roads Movement 6 whole pages as a starting organization that helped promote RDOT in the first place. The group was successful in persuading Governor James P. Clark to schedule a Good Roads Convention in Little Rock in 1896. On April 9, 1896, the committee met and created Arkansas's first formal Good Roads organization, the Good Roads League of the State of Arkansas. The Fort Smith chapter of the Wheelmen was called the Rex Wheelmen. There was a Rex bicycle company based out of Chicago, but the earliest I could find a record of them was 1898, and since the Rex Wheelmen existed in 1896, it can be intuited that the Rex in their name is meant to stand for the Latin king. So in today's parlance, the Rex Wheelmen might be called the King Cyclists. The Rex Wheelmen, also known as the Rex Club, would host a number of amateur cycling races in the area for a few years, such as this bicycle race in Van Buren or this race in Fort Smith. They seem to host a race every 4th of July. The head of the Rex Wheelmen was a man named William B. McCorkle, and he was probably Fort Smith's first cycling advocate with enough gusto to have his name in the paper a number of times. He ran a drugstore called McCorkle's at 1000 Garrison Avenue, which is where Tipsy's is today. You can get a taste of what McCorkle's drugstore might be like from this time period at the Fort Smith Museum of History, where they have an entire display meant to look like a drugstore from the time. What they don't mention at the museum is that it could be a cyclist drugstore. Of particular interest is this article from 1896. This provides a list of everyone who called themselves a wheelman, including women and children. I didn't research every name on this list, there's just too many, but here's McCorkle listed as riding a Columbia bicycle. Let's put a pin in this article because I'd like to come back to it later. So amateur races are great, but the Wheelmen's purpose wasn't just to organize local races. They were formed because they were frustrated about something. Just listen to this report on one of their races. The track itself was in poor condition for racing because of the dust. Not having been used for some time and being allowed to grow up to weeds, the labor of repairing it and getting it into condition for speed was greater than had been anticipated. The first turn and quarter were in fair condition, but from the first quarter stake to the turn onto the stretch, the track was anything but good. Or this story of how the Rex Wheelmen met to discuss building a racetrack on 11th Street, but couldn't because it was too expensive. If the Wheelmen couldn't improve existing cycle tracks or build new ones, their only recourse left was to petition the government for better roadway conditions. Indeed, as petitioned by the writer in this article, the LAW should focus not on cycle tracks but on roadways. The Wheelmen, the cycling community, took this advice and ran with it. They started a national conversation about paving roads to make for better cycling conditions. And no town in America was exempt from this, including Fort Smith. And just so we're clear on the time frame, this started in Fort Smith as early as 1894. Cyclists have decided that what they want this summer is good roads. They are crying for good roads and accomplishing much in that direction. This was 4 years before the first automobile appeared in Fort Smith, and decades longer before the auto became the default method of travel. I only bring this up because some people throw around phrases like roadways were meant for cars or roadways were designed for cars, when the truth of the matter is, our historic dirt roads were originally meant for horses and wagons, and the paved roads were originally meant for and designed for bicycles. This article of Bicycle Chat is hard to make out, but I read, "It is a greater force of thing in Arkansas that has led to a movement for better roads into and out of the state. Then indeed will be wheelmen who accomplished a great mission and this is what is happening in other states. In July of 1900, the LAW would meet at their national conference and spend an entire day dedicated to the good roads movement. It was also about this time that cyclists got more formal pushback. Fort Smith enacted its first bicycle ordinance, which was that cyclists would have to affix a lamp to their vehicle, and speeds in the city were limited to 4 miles per hour. And a version of this law still exists in Arkansas to this day. At the time, the wheelmen were criticized for not doing more to fight this ordinance because 4 miles per hour is barely faster than walking. But on the plus side, bicycles were now street legal. So, since bicycles were street legal, wouldn't that mean they ought to, have some bikeable streets, right? Where do you think they started? You might know the name Colonel William Cravens. He was our congressman for 3 terms in the early 20th century, but before that he lived off North 15th and B Street, just across the street from where the wheelmen had plans to build a cycle track. And it could be that he rode for the wheelmen on a Viking. Now, is this the same Will Cravens as Colonel William Cravens? Probably not. Sparing you the details of all the various William Cravens I found at the time, it's likely that this is a Mr. Will Cravens who served as chief deputy to Marshal Crump. We know that Mr. Cravens and Colonel Cravens are not the same person because Mr. Cravens served under Judge Parker until 1889, and Colonel Cravens was Fort Smith's city attorney at the time. But either way, in February of 1888, it was Colonel Cravens who presided over the very first meeting to discuss paving roads in Fort Smith. Second in charge was a Mr. Thierer. The meeting ended without much result, but they did form a committee to decide what material the pavement should use. And there are some familiar names on that committee, including a W. Ayers, a Johnson, a Kelly, and a Sparks. Are the people on the committee the same wheelmen listed here? Most assuredly not, but they could be family members. And I am confident that W. Ayers on the committee is one of the 2 W. Ayers listed here. By 2 years later, Garrison Avenue was paved by brick. Brick is great for cycling, but not for other usage. The road lasted only 11 years because it couldn't put up with sharing usage with wagons and heavy carts. This was the first case in our city's history to show the importance of complete streets, and that lack of future-proofing meant the city had to spend more money to pave Garrison again. So, learning from their mistake, the city planned to completely repave Garrison with wooden blocks. But what to do with all these extra bricks? The bricks went on to pave our alleyways for the first time. So it can at least be inferred that perhaps some of our various alleyways were originally designed as bikeways. And just to come full circle, the bricks used to pave them were made by the Fort Smith Brick Company, which merged with Acme Brick in 1932. The old Acme Brickyard at Old Greenwood Road is now slated to be converted to a drainage field with a strong possibility for cycling infrastructure. I'm telling you guys, bicycle advocacy is in our blood. Once Garrison and the alleyways were paved, the remaining streets followed soon. The city also heard from the infrastructure cult for the first time. If you haven't heard of the infrastructure cult, it's an actual term used in niches of economics and urban planning. But basically, the infrastructure cult is the idea that many or most people unwaveringly believe, without a mathematical foundation, that all infrastructure spending must somehow be good. That's the infrastructure cult. Mad about $5 million water slides, perfectly happy to spend 3 times as much to widen a quiet street with no traffic. And here's the first place I could find it pop up in Fort Smith. Pave the whole city at once, and if it runs in debt, let the young folks who come later pay it off. Pave the streets anyway, no matter if we are 100 red years paying for it or what the cost may be. And so we did. And so we are in debt 100 years later. This was the start of the consent decree. Interestingly, in the next column over, we have the senior McCorkle introducing the strong towns mindset to Fort Smith for the first time, balancing improvement value with land value. It is a good thing for the town, but the question in my mind is, are we ready for it? Some streets could afford it, but there are others where the streets are thinly settled, the outskirts of the city. It would be working a hardship on the property owner there. Only the streets that can afford it should be paved. By the Roaring '20s, modern network configurations would begin in earnest on the coast and Detroit and slowly make its way towards Arkansas. Fort Smith updated its comprehensive traffic plan in 1927 and expanded on the role of bicycles as a component of traffic. Fort Smith would also begin its first mobility plan in 1929. Walk, bike, roll, run. This is our history. The new movement ordinances were enough to flood Fort Smith with a new cycling renaissance. Bicycles making great comeback. Fort Smith has increase in bicycle sales. Young and old are taking to wheels as bicycle fad invades Fort Smith, with an especially big demand for girls' wheels. Fort Smith's feminine fashionables are on wheels. Bicycle sales hold up for months after comeback is started. Dealers declare more bicycles have been sold during the last 2 years than during the previous 10. Bicycles were back, and the Wheelmen were back too, hosting new races, this time on legal street courses. The race ran all over the north side of town in a gigantic loop. This route, you could say, is our first legacy loop. It should also be pointed out that 1935 was the first year that the police also started a traffic safety plan and include some of the same safety recommendations, such as daylighting, that the city is still working towards finally implementing after 90 years. But the good times didn't last for long. Bicycles were beginning to be seen as more of a child's hobby activity as teenagers and adults began lusting after the social gravitas of automobiles. This sparked increased safety campaigns for bicycles, mostly focused on children, and mostly placing the blame for cycling accidents on the cyclists themselves. At the time, the city had about 5,000 daily automobile drivers and 1,000 daily bicycle drivers, and the plan was to allow them to peacefully coexist. This bicycle safety club was started, the Junior Highway Bicycle Safety Patrol was started, the chief of police began printing rules to bicycle riders in the paper, and even social organizations such as the Optimist Club, the Lions Club, and the Rotary Club all got in on the action by hosting their own safety campaigns for bicycles. So with all this focus on safety for bicycles, shouldn't safety get dramatically better? By the very end of the 1950s, there was a dramatic change indeed. What happened? The city and all of its social clubs spent the better part of 2 decades educating the populace on bicycle safety. The police chief and city council passed and enforced new, robust laws to keep cyclists safe. So what was the missing piece that actually saw cycling accidents increase so dramatically in 1958? The answer to that will have to wait for another video.